Welcome to Ann Arbor Democracy, a place for conversation about how our local leaders are elected and how political decisions are made, what this looked like in the past and what it looks like now. This project aims to explore the recent history and current reality of Ann Arbor democracy. This is part 2 of an interview with Colleen McGee, who served on Ann Arbor City Council from 1974 to 1976. In local elections of 1972, a leftist third party called the Human Rights Party gained enough support to elect 2 candidates to City Council. In 1973 elections, Republicans were able to win 2 seats with less than a majority. In the mayoral race, Republican Jim Stevenson beat Democratic candidate Franz Magdas and HRP candidate Benita Kamowitz. The Human Rights Party, or HRP, was widely seen as taking votes away from Democratic Party candidates. The HRP was blamed for splitting the vote and causing the Republican victories of 1973. In 1974, Democrats managed to flip 2 seats. Jamie Kenworthy took a Republican seat in Ward 4, and Colleen McGee won the Ward 1 seat previously held by the HRP. In advance of the 1975 elections, by citywide referendum, Ann Arbor approved a plan for preferential voting, allowing residents to rank candidates rather than making only one choice. This method would be used in the mayoral election only. Preferential voting was seen as a strategy for preventing the 3-way split that had elected Republican Mayor Jim Stevenson in 1973. In 1975, the preferential voting system elected the city's first and only black mayor, Al Wheeler. In part 2, Colleen talks about the 1975 transition from Mayor Stevenson to Mayor Wheeler, the city's non-discrimination ordinance, and what it was like working with council and staff colleagues. Well, and you straddled 2 different mayors also, and I'm really curious. Actually, maybe I worded that strangely.
No. James Stevenson, Al Wheeler, oh boy.
They were very different, I assume.
Yes. Jim Stevenson was a patent attorney who was, we used to call them rock-ribbed of Republicans. They were just granite-like, they stood for things and you weren't going to move them. And they had a very strong sense of right and wrong. Most of what they thought were wrong, I thought was, my preferred lifestyle, but they were ethical and they were committed. And I think that's one of the big differences I see between the Republicans then and conservatives now, or even our city council, is that the differences were differences in community vision. I had one vision of what the community could be like, and they had another one, and they were appalled by my vision. I do have to say about Jim was that he truly believed everything he said and did. It was an ethical stance from his position. Wrong as all get out, but ethical.
And the transition to Al Wheeler was quite messy because
that wasn't even messy. It was chaos.
Well, tell me about that. From your perspective, you didn't have a lot of power. You were sort of an observer, but a close observer. What was happening?
Well, we all worked our butts off until the polls closed on the night of the election. And then we just I went to bed. I was tired. We'd been busting butt for, like 4 days without sleep. We all knew it was going to be tight. But what we were really hoping was that Al would get a tiny, tiny, tiny majority. And we wouldn't have to go through all of that ranked choice voting stuff, because that was contentious. It was, it had been passed, but it was not wholeheartedly accepted. And so, of course, nobody had a majority, that there were only pluralities, and the ranked choice voting kicked in. It was chaos. Again, the Republicans are screaming about how undemocratic it is, and Jim Stevenson is trying to claim that he's you know, he's won the election and all this stuff is unconstitutional. And of course, then the lawyers take over and it disappears into the legal cloud for months, running up through, circuit courts. They had to take it to the Jackson Circuit Court because all of the Washtenaw County judges recused themselves. Oh, yeah. I mean,
Wow.
so it was heard by a Jackson County circuit court judge, and then went to the appeals court, and then I mean, just
And so I'm looking at a timeline of when people served, and that contested election actually creates a little bit of a blip where there's a delay. The elections, the elections happened in April.
we used to campaign in the primary in February. If you want to talk about bloody knuckles, knocking on doors in pre-climate change February, Michigan.
That sounds grim.
It was.
So if you
But it made you look so earnest and.
so if you were elected in an election day in April, when were you supposed to be seated?
A week later.
Oh, real? Okay.
Yeah, it was. That was actually pretty brutal because you got elected, you got sworn in the next week, and you were immediately into budget. So the first thing you dealt with on council was
The most complicated thing.
the most complicated, arcane issues of that the city deals with, and that was budget because it had to be, enacted before the end of June.
So Stevenson just stayed in office
Right.
through the budget.
Yeah.
So what were some of the bigger issues that you remember trying to untangle when you were on council?
Oh, all the same ones. I noticed in one of the links you sent that Kathy got in trouble with Jim because she had gone to protest the Israeli president showing up, and there were people protesting their treatment of Palestinians.
Yeah, that stuck out for me because it's certainly timely.
Well, it's not so much that it's timely, is that, and Martin Luther King said this one may not happen in my lifetime. I'm still, we're still worried about ballot access. We're still worried about Palestinian and Israeli settlement issue, who lives where. We're still worried about all these things that I've been worrying about for, a lifetime, 50, 60 years. And when I was young, I thought I was going to solve all those problems. and then I read something like, Beth going to protest the Israeli president. And I go, oh, yeah, I was a legal observer for one of those protests last week.
Wow.
It just, yeah, we just keep going. I saw a headline that somewhere that said, we've made a lot of progress, but now they're trying to take it back. And that really helped frame the current political situation for me, is not that we've got all these things, but that we've just scrabbled our way up this cliff face, and now they're trying to kick our fingers off again. We haven't won anything, Roe versus Wade, here we are. All these issues that were critical to my life when I was 25 are still critical to my life when I'm 75.
Yeah, it's like we don't remember anything that came before.
I was on the Human Rights Commission before I was on council. And David Cahill and I, it was not very well attended. We had trouble getting quorums and all that sort of stuff. So David and I came up with a bylaw change that said any two people attending made a quorum. And that made people start attending a whole lot because they were afraid David and I were going to make changes they didn't approve of. We got, one of the problems with civil rights enforcement is that often it's a civil issue and not a criminal issue. And so it's on the person to bring the action in the courts. David and I hatched a plan, and we got some amendments to the Ann Arbor Civil Rights Ordinance that impose criminal penalties for people who violated civil rights within the city limits, which meant that the city attorney had to prosecute those things, not individual citizens. But one of the things we amended it was, and this is very old-fashioned phrasing, was your sexual preference. You could no longer discriminate against people in housing, public accommodation, and employment in Ann Arbor based on sexual preference, which
We don't use that term now, but
right.
that was what the way it was
That's
said.
what sexual orientation, that was the proper term for it, the polite term for orientation at that time. And so Ann Arbor, unlike most places in the country, it was illegal to discriminate against people based on their sexual orientation. So when Kathy ran, nobody cared. Her being, a gay, lesbian, whatever she wanted to be, was not a campaign issue. Which is, it's Kathy, She's crazy because she's HRP, but, otherwise she's fine. If you go look through all the political ads in the Ann Arbor News there, it's never an issue. There's no letters to the editor. It was her politics that were the problem, not who she's, in bed with. I'm not saying that that kind of discrimination wasn't happening. We put a ordinance with teeth into action because it was happening. I mean, that ordinance did not come out of nowhere. And we did not switch from civil to criminal enforcement for no reason.
Right.
But in general, in the progressive, liberal, democratic, leftist, whatever circles, or sexual orientation was not of any importance in terms of electability.
Some of the racial incidents of the time did prompt more serious conversation, and I want you to share with me what your reaction was to an incident that happened in your ward.
We had a break-in at a gas station near where Broadway and Pontiac, everybody comes together at the bridge over the river. And the police were called and they fired shots at fleeing suspects. But we had a police commission. There were at least some council members who were pulled together. I don't recall whether we had citizens. We may have had a couple pastors or something on there to look into this use of force for a property crime. That was sort of the progressive perspective on that. It's property crimes you do not shoot at people who are committing property crimes, even if you can watch them do it. That's just excessive. But yeah, that was outrageous that the police had fired a gun at a fleeing suspect. First, that they were running away, and second, that it was a property crime.
You told me that you did ride-alongs with the police.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was a progressive. And I believed that all cops were bastards. It's been a long lifetime here. And so one of the things when I got on council was I wanted to see what this was all about. And so every week I would go down to the police station and I would say, would you please assign me to a car? And at that time we had enough staffing that we had 2 people in every car. And the first time I did it, they told me I couldn't. And they said, you can't. And I said, yes, I can. I'm a council person. And they said, you have to get a letter from the chief of police, Walter Krasny. I said, okay. So I stomped into Krasny's office, got my letter, and stomped back down the next week. And they, huffed and puffed and gave me. And the next week I came back and they said again, you have to get a letter. And I'm going, I've already been through this. So I stomped into Krasny's office. And this is 1974. Stomped back down. So eventually it took about 4 or 5 weeks of getting a letter and walking downstairs. And they finally started letting me just come in and say, assign me to some new officers. And I tried to ride with every officer on the force over, I don't know, 6 months or a year, maybe a year and a half. I was just riding. And I rode with all the fire squads. In fact, I trained as a volunteer firefighter because one of our lieutenants was teaching out at WCC. And so there I am out burning a barn. We were having a live, exercise as graduation. I rip off my helmet when we're relieved, and the poor guy behind me on the hose goes, "Oh my God, it's a girl." Because at the time, there were no women firefighters. There were no women police officers. We only had, I think, as I was leaving, one or two women as police officers. So it was a very masculine environment. And that poor volunteer firefighter who discovered that he'd been working with a girl. Anyway, so here we are riding along with the police. Happens I ride with everybody. I think, sometimes I think just your presence there makes people think twice about how they respond to things. Not that I stopped it, but just, yeah. So we got to be pretty good friends with a lot of the people, especially the head of the patrolmen's union. So I was chatting with one of those officers in the late 80s, early 90s. And he was telling me about what a hassle it had been to have me ride. And I went, "Why?" And he said, "Didn't you know you had a red file?" And I said, "No." "Me?" The police and FBI had illegally had bunches of us radicals under surveillance. And so every time I wanted to get in a police car, it was a subject under surveillance wanting to ride around the city, listening in on all their radio talk and watching them work. I was a real problem for them.
What do you suppose triggered that? How do you suppose...
J. Edgar Hoover. He saw communists everywhere.
But how do you suppose that you attracted that identity?
The Sun endorsed me.
Oh,
I was
goodness.
a union organizer.
Okay.
I'm a troublemaker. Of course they were interested. Now, I didn't think I was causing, I thought it was all good trouble. John Lewis, good trouble. But they had a different opinion. Firmly held, ethically held, but wrong.
So who were some of your real allies when you were on council? Folks that you had an easy time working with.
Well, Norris.
Who were more challenging?
Norris was good. Norris Thomas was a black legal aid attorney who later went to the appellate legal aid court, and there's now an award given to appellate defense attorneys who do pro bono work for the Norris Thomas Award. One that you really ought to talk to is Liz Keogh. She was known as Elizabeth Taylor when she was on the county commission, and she challenged Perry Bullard for state rep. Liz and I had some wild times. Liz was she left here and went back to being a union organizer in California. She was sprightly. She didn't pay her taxes. A portion of her income tax she always refused to pay because it was supporting the Vietnam War. She had attorneys up the wazoo helping her not pay her war taxes.
Wow.
Yeah. So, in fact, Lizzie is another interesting story about how politics work. So Lizzie and I were sometimes talked about as potential, if Perry went to Congress, who might replace him. Again, this is before term limits in the state seat. So who might replace Perry once he decided to go to Congress in state representative? And Liz and I were considered possible candidates. And we had a deal The deal was that one of us would run and one would be the campaign manager. And the way we would decide who the candidate was we would flip a coin. And the loser had to be the candidate.
That is a great story. Oh my goodness, that is so great.
Carol Jones, you should talk to Carol. Carol and I used to go rafting down the Huron River with not very many clothes on. Who else? Jamie always had a problem with me. He said I reminded him of his older sister, and he just couldn't abide. I don't know. Jamie was an interesting character.
Then there was Jerry Bell, Gerald Bell.
Yeah, Jerry wasn't very much. Roger Bertoya. Lou Belcher. Oh my goodness, Lou Belcher. He firmly believed things, but I didn't get that core integrity sense from him. He was more flexible in who could persuade him to do things. And so, yeah.
There was Bob Henry.
Bob was actually very good. Bob was an attorney and, wiggly as all get out like most attorneys are. But, if you followed his legal logic, it made sense.
And Ronald Trowbridge.
I don't remember Trowbridge so much. He was just another annoying Republican who didn't say very much. If I needed Fourth Ward stuff, it was Jamie.
In part 3, Colleen talks about the history of Lansky's junkyard, debates around planning and development, and her ongoing work as a progressive activist. Like and subscribe if you'd like to be alerted to more content like this.